Not only do I believe that hip and shoulder separation drills aren't good, I believe they make a lot of players worse. If you're familiar with what I like to talk about, it's how we get guys to transform into what I call spine-dominant pitchers. When guys can use their spine as the primary source of velocity, power, and movement and adjustments, everything else seems to fall in line. Things get simpler, things get easier, and when guys get what I call the effortless velocity point to click, they feel more effortless. They feel like velocity is coming out harder without having to try as hard. They feel like stress on their arm goes down, effort goes down, but the radar doesn't change. A lot of guys, their velocity goes up. A lot of guys, they feel like they command the ball better. Their arm pain is gone. Their arm soreness is gone because they've reached this EV point, or effortless velocity point. And they only get to that by becoming aware of the spine, how to position it, how to use it, and how to make it the primary mover. And when it comes to hip and shoulder separation drills, you're separating the spine into pieces. A spine by itself as one unit is incredibly strong. Once you just take part of it and you try to rotate something or move something, not only does it look a little bit disconnected, which doesn't look quite right to the eye, not only does it lose power and velocity and speed, but once you put it into a drill, you get guys that, man, I can't seem to figure out why they look so robotic, why they look pushy, why they don't look smooth or athletic or loose or quite normal. It's because guys are trying to force this imaginary position. And when I say imaginary, it's not that that position doesn't happen. Hip and shoulder separation does happen, but it's not because it's forced. And when it's forced and guys try to yank into it and hold back, you got one thing that's going forward, one thing that's going back, and it just doesn't feel quite right or smooth. And for 100 years before slow motion video was ever a thing, guess what? Guys never talked about hip and shoulder separation. It wasn't a thing. It never came up, and there were 0 drills for it. And guess what? Dudes were able to throw really hard without ever having to think about it or worry about it. What I see a lot of guys try to figure out is, okay, if everyone that throws hard gets hip and shoulder separation, well then I need to get it too. And if I go after it and I find it, I'll throw harder. But it's a pretty complex movement. And if you're trying to put the pieces together, you'll almost never find it. And if you think you do, things won't look very smooth. It'll be looked very forced. You might look great and then you all of a sudden try to jab it and it looks like you're trying to jab and it doesn't look smooth. And so when I watch video after video and talk to guy after guy, and after 15 years, over 1,000 guys just in person, plus remotely, and just watching hundreds of thousands of videos, the guys that move the best are not thinking about hip and shoulder separation. They're not trying to get into a position. They're trying to get into a flow. There's the analogy that's been used, you don't get into positions on a bike. You just feel the flow of the bike and you go and you pedal and there's a flow to it. There's not positions that you're trying to get to. You don't try to force extension of the leg and then pulling back of the leg and all these, you don't do that. You find the flow. And you find that flow based on a similar point, a similar balance or center of gravity where there's a flow that's controlled because you're only on those 2 wheels and you kind of got to find that balance and flow. Similarly, to get to a point where this hip and shoulder separation is going to happen on its own, you got to get to what I call the EV point, the effortless velocity point, which comes from situating your spine so that your posture is intact, and everyone's a little bit different, taking your spine and moving it directionally toward the target so that it can get down the mound, which is also unique to every person based on their hip anatomy. And then we have to learn how to rotate it. And all of these hip and shoulder separation and back leg drive and push and triple extension drills and all these linear things are the primary teach and the primary focus for instructors across the country, people online and in person, and have been for decades. And we wonder why guys don't look as good. And we wonder why the kid who's 8 that moves really well, that never pitches, and never has to talk to an instructor, and doesn't get taught all these positions and things, why he, 15 years later, moves so well and so cleanly and so effortlessly. It's because they were never worried about hip and shoulder separation, just like people weren't for years and years and years. Those guys do separate their hips and their shoulders. Yes, they get into that position, and because of it, they throw hard. But they didn't get into a hip and shoulder separation position because they were trying to get into a hip and shoulder separation position. What we like to tell guys is to let's unseparate them and put them back together. Let's take the hips and the shoulders, let's put them back together, keep them together in our mind as we counter rotate, as we get into our load or our bend or our getting into our back leg, as we stride, keep it together, as we rotate, keep it together, and take this strong position back. Take the strong position down and through the mountain in this nice, easy flow. Keeping this connected in our mind, keeping it strong. Think about two ends of a seat belt, here, and putting them together. That's a common analogy that guys use. To take the seat belt, close it together, to tuck things together. And then you hold these together in your mind as long as possible, all the way through the flow of it. And when you do that, what happens is you feel stronger, you feel more in tune or connected, it feels like it's easier, and then naturally, because your body's freaking amazing, you'll see in slow motion video, you still get the hip and shoulder separation. Assuming you've done a lot of drill work, you've done a lot of patterning, and realized and started to just groove that movement, that this spine is really powerful and it can rotate really powerfully, whether that's a med ball slam, whether that's a scoop toss, whether it's a throw, a drill. Once we can train rotation, find that EV point through setting ourselves up and maintaining it all the way through, now you're in a good spot where your body's gonna naturally move how it's supposed to, and it's gonna look really, really good, and you don't ever have to think again about separating the two, because by counterintuitively keeping them together, they naturally will separate and things will be incredible.